Well, welcome everybody to this fifth in our series of Burns lectures for this year. My name's Murray Ray from the Theology program, and it's the Theology program that is hosting these lectures, generously funded by the Presbyterian Synod of Otago and Southland. I'm not sure how long the Synod has been funding these lectures, but it's at least since the 1980s on a biannual basis, so we're very grateful for their support. Welcome back to those who have been with us through much of the series, and welcome to the one or two new faces that I also see this evening. Our lecturer, of course, is Dr. Cathy Ross, who works for the CMS in Oxford. You'll see her credentials on the screen here, and also lectures in mission at Regent's Park College. But we're proud to claim her as one of our own, a fellow New Zealander. She's been lecturing, of course, through the series on mission, and the title tonight is Mission and Empire. Welcome to those who are online as well. I should have welcomed you earlier. And as has been our practice in the past lectures, if you'd like to ask questions at the end, please go to the Theology Facebook page, enter your question in the post there, and we'll pick them up and do our best to ask Cathy your questions. So Cathy, welcome again. We're thoroughly enjoying the series so far and look forward to tonight's lecture on mission and empire. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray. Kia ora tātou. Good evening, everyone. So I've entitled tonight's lecture, Another World is Here, Mission and Empire, Octavius Hadfield, Pioneering Prophet or Complicit Colonialist. So this paper actually was co-written by myself and my colleague James Butler as a result of a conversation that we had around mission and empire. So we decided to work it up into a paper, and we've used Octavius Hadfield as a kind of case study. I hasten to add, I am not an expert on Octavius Hadfield. I actually know more about his wife, Kate, because she was one of the women I looked at for my PhD. But that piqued my interest in Octavius because obviously, when you read about the wives, you also read something of their husbands. And I was always interested in Octavius. He struck me as a very interesting character in his advocacy for Māori. So we've used Hadfield as a kind of case study, or more precisely, one particular event that Hadfield was involved in during his life in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I'd like to begin this paper by acknowledging where James and I write from. We do write from within empire. As scholar Dorothy Zerler has said, we are doing our theology while still living in Egypt. While we may not like this label, we have to acknowledge that we are white. My colleague James and I, he's English. We live in a prosperous nation, whether that's the UK or Aotearoa, and continue to benefit from empire. And as we turn to discuss Octavius Hadfield, we acknowledge that we have a lot more in common with Hadfield than with Māori. As much as we want to critique and learn, there is something in us which wants to name Hadfield as the goody, if you like, the pioneering prophet, as the one who was compromised by empire but tried to do his best to be faithful to God and to be a good friend to Māori. We too have experienced this tension in cross-cultural mission. I've worked in Rwanda, Congo and Uganda. James has worked in Uruguay and other Latin American countries, and we know we have not done everything right. We've struggled with our privilege and our position. We have felt the pressure to evangelize, to show ourselves worthy of the support we received. We have also sought to be good friends and allies to those with whom we have worked. We have wanted to be known as the goodies. But can we step back enough to ask deeper questions? Perhaps in reading Hadfield, we can get beyond asking this binary question, whether he was a pioneering prophet or complicit colonialist, and instead ask deeper questions that can disclose our own complicity with the empires of our time. Our tendency to relate more easily to Hadfield than the Māori clearly shapes this paper, and it would undoubtedly look very different from the perspective of the colonised, those not living in Egypt. So Octavius Hadfield was initially a CMS missionary in Aotearoa, New Zealand from 1839 until he became Bishop of Wellington in 1870 and later Primate. He died in 1904 at the age of 91. He was born on the Isle of Wight, studied at Pembroke College in Oxford, but never completed his studies due to ill health. In fact, that's why he was sent to Aotearoa, New Zealand, rather than India, I think. So clearly, New Zealand agreed with him. He went to Australia, where he was ordained a deacon, and as he did not have a university degree, he couldn't be ordained as a priest, but this changed when Bishop Broughton of Sydney was asked to visit Aotearoa in 1839. He became the first priest to be ordained here. He spent nearly all his missionary service in Waikanai and Otaki, 40 miles north of Wellington rather. His geographical area of responsibility was huge and stretched to include roughly the bottom third of the North Island. The incident that we're considering occurred 20 years into his missionary service and concerned the unjust sale of Māori land to settlers in Taranaki. Hadfield was fluent in Māori and was considered by Māori missionaries and the government to be an expert in Māori land ownership. He had also prevented a major Māori attack on Wellington. He was considered a peacemaker, friend of the Māori, and respected by some in the colonial government. By others, he was called a traitor and the most hated man in New Zealand for his advocacy for and defence of local Māori. So in this presentation, I'll consider the following issues: land and Māori responses, justice, theological anthropology, the colonial logic of mission, and conclude with some learnings. So unusual among missionaries of the time, Hadfield was extremely well informed on Māori understandings of land. He had spent 18 years studying native titles to land and wrote a paper on this subject for Governor Sir George Grey. He was so incensed by the injustice of the sale of this particular tract of land in Taranaki that he wrote a series of pamphlets to the Secretary of State for the Colonies, the first one of which was entitled One of England's Little Wars, when he excoriated in the strongest terms the flagrant act of injustice by the governor, the ignorance of the land commissioners, and the attack, or little war as he called it, on the local Māori. Hadfield had learned that Indigenous attitudes to and ownership of land are very different from English understandings. However, in the 19th century, many missionaries challenged the understandings shared by Indigenous peoples about their sense of identity, their sense of well-being, and their relationship with the land, creation, and place. And I was speaking about this yesterday in the lecture on whiteness. Some of these early Europeans came to new places which they defined in their own terms, and they designated in categories familiar to them. They divided ancient tribal groupings, they created borders with straight lines, they developed racial categories. They challenged and destroyed the deeply held beliefs and practices of Indigenous peoples. African-American theologian Willie James Jennings explains that the early missionaries brought a very different understanding of how to be in the world. He wrote, this crucial educational hope was to disabuse native peoples of any idea that lands and animals, landscapes and seasons carried any communicative or animate destiny, and therefore any ethical or moral direction in how to live in the world. Instead, they offered peoples a relationship with the world that was basically one-dimensional. We interpret and manipulate the world as we see fit, taking from it what we need and caring for it within the logic of making it more productive for us. For Indigenous peoples, we know that the place is in them. They are the place, the land, and the nation. And we know this, coming from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where Māori define themselves according to their place, their mountain, their river or sea, and their tribe. So just as in the Genesis creation account, Indigenous myths of origin are closely linked to the land, and these are a source of identity and orientation in the world. Enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and Professor of Botany Robin Wall Kimmerer explains this Indigenous worldview. She says, for all of us, becoming Indigenous to a place means living as if your children's future mattered, to take care of the land as if our lives, both material and spiritual, depended on it. Tongan biblical scholar Dr. Havea explains how the land is gendered both male and female for island peoples in the South Pacific. He writes, as mother, the land is the primary carer of us. As father, the land connects us to those who have passed, to one another and to those who are to come, and to the circles of life around us. He also asserts that the colonial project has feminized the land to license its taking, rape, and exploitation. Jennings takes this further by claiming that colonialism has resourced and produced a theology of extraction, supported by three crucial agents necessary for that earth-shattering work: the merchant, the missionary, and the soldier. This is clearly demonstrated in Hadfield's explanation of the unjust sale of land in his letter to the then General Secretary of CMS, Henry Venn. He wrote, "The government has taken hostile proceedings against a chief, Waramukingi, and his tribe, because they have resisted the survey of land which belongs to them, but which an individual native, Teira, has sold to the government land agent." To my utter astonishment, a few weeks ago, I learnt that the governor had taken troops to Taranaki, had issued a proclamation authorising martial law, and had marched troops onto the disputed land, and on the withdrawal of the natives who were residing in paths quite indefensible, had destroyed these. In this instance, Hadfield is the missionary who defends the Indigenous worldview and advocates on their behalf both to CMS and to the British government in his series of pamphlets to the Secretary of State for the Colonies. The merchant is the government land agent acquiring land for the settlers, and the soldiers are sent by the British government forcibly to subdue the Māori and begin what Hadfield calls one of England's little wars. Waramukingi is a Christian and a friend of Hadfield. He resolutely opposes the sale of the land to the settlers, and he writes movingly to the governor, and this is his letter, and the italics are his own. He writes, "I will not agree to our bedroom being sold, for this bed belongs to the whole of us. And do you not be in haste to give the money? Do you hearken to my word? If you give the money secretly, you will get no land for it. You may insist, but I will never agree to it. All I have to say to you, O Governor, is that none of this land will be given to you. Never, never, not till I die." The Māori understanding of land contrasts with a European worldview that has so often reduced land to an inert or utilitarian resource for our own use. This is indeed an extraction worldview, whereas many Indigenous cultures practice more of a gift mentality. Maori theologian J. Martinga writes that the Maori worldview is of a sharing and gift economy, but that when industrialisation was imposed, it was out of sync with Maori souls, and like most Indigenous people around the world, it then proved a fast track to poverty. Martinga reminds us of their spiritual and emotional connection to material reality. Just as Jesus had a relationship with the created order, where we see the winds and the waves obeying him, Martinga claims that private ownership is not typical in Indigenous ways of knowing, but it is endemic to Western thinkers. So in this extract from Kingi's letter to the governor, we see his personal and familial attachment to the land. It is their bedroom. He's not interested in money because you do not sell the family bedroom, as it belongs to everyone and no one person has any right or desire to sell it. Hadfield understood and appreciated this relationship with the land, and he'd assured the Maori that the British government never would unjustly seize their lands. In this instance, he later realised that he had misled them, and he was therefore ashamed to meet with them. And Kingi also declares that this piece of land belongs to us. It belongs to the orphan. It belongs to the widow. Again, we see here a deeply communal understanding of ownership, as well as one which prioritises those on the margins and those at risk. This has striking resonances with a biblical understanding of the land and how it can serve the poor and the widow, such as in the Old Testament story of Ruth. And as we have seen, for Maori, their lives and their identity depended fundamentally on their land. So they were not going to give up their land easily, nor were they prepared to engage in violence. They were certainly not willing to accept the investigation initiated by the government on behalf of the governor, as Hadfield explained in his pamphlet, whose business is to purchase land and who, by the very nature of his office, is disqualified in the estimation of the natives, impartially to investigate claims to land. However, the governor quickly adopted colonial logic and sent soldiers on a warship to deal with the situation. Jennings claims that this triad of merchant, missionary, and soldier reordered our sense of land, animal, plant, earth, and each other through forming life into abiding enclosure. This then led to new understandings of boundaries, identity, and existence, which were then internalized. He writes, the production of lines to separate spaces that were in fact not separate took on a new economic determination as the privatization of land and places sliced through the forms of identity, both social and human. Yet the line outside the body was also the line within the body, as people were habituated to see the line that was not in fact there and internalized the line as a boundary of existence. In this context in Taranaki, the lines were literally being drawn by surveyors, marking out the land between their surveying pegs. This was privatizing land, creating enclosures, and taking away more than just land. This was the literal slicing of identity in space, body, and time. Local Maori responded to these invasive actions in a creative and subversive way. The women and children not only removed the surveyors' measuring pegs, but they also hugged the surveyors so they could not do their surveying. This demonstrates their commitment to peaceful protest in contrast to the British response to send troops and gunships. We also see here, I think, a fascinating gendered response and a clever use of bodies to thwart the surveyors. The governor then declared martial law, and when the local Māori refused to give up their land, a party of surveyors fired the first shots, followed by field guns and naval rocket tubes pouring a barrage of shells at them. And so began the first wave of the land wars. Hadfield expressed his opinion to the Secretary of State for the Colonies in the strongest terms possible. He wrote, "The governor's attack on William King was not only impolitic, but under the present circumstances of the colony, an act of folly closely bordering on insanity." While Hadfield wrote a lengthy pamphlet to the colonial powers, local Māori took both a personal and communal approach. I've quoted excerpts of Kingi's own letter to the governor outlining his refusal to sell the land. 500 chiefs also wrote a petition to the Queen, imploring her to act justly. They wrote, "This unjust conduct on the part of the governor has filled us all with grief and consternation. We are quite sure that your Majesty has not sanctioned the principle that land is to be forcibly taken away from your Majesty's subjects, many of them widows and orphans. For these reasons, we, your Majesty's faithful and loyal subjects, address your Majesty and pray that this governor may be recalled, that this island may not be involved in war, and that your Majesty will send another governor who may know how to govern in accordance with the law and your Majesty's instructions, and that we and the white inhabitants may dwell together in peace and love to your Majesty, and we will ever pray that your Majesty's sovereignty may prosper." So it's noticeable that they appealed to the Queen, believing her to be the highest authority, and that again they refer to the widows and orphans, appealing to a sense of justice on behalf of the marginalised. They are clear that they want the current governor removed because of his unjust actions, which resulted in a war. And twice they refer to prayer. The Māori approach is clearly communal and invokes scripture by their reference to widows and orphans. Their worldview seems to have been shaped by a Christian frame of reference alongside their own Indigenous cultural values. For a settler, Hadfield had an unparalleled understanding of Māori customs and culture with respect to land ownership, and he had an important role in communicating and translating that to the settler population. It's heartening and encouraging to see his close friendship with Kingi and his support for him. However, this was all framed within a peculiarly British understanding of justice. So let's move on to consider that. As we've already seen, Hadfield immediately recognised and spoke out about the injustice of the British possession of the land. His pamphlets, on which we're reflecting here, are an attempt to highlight this injustice, and they appeal to the British government. Hadfield's public condemnation of the government reveals a bold and deep commitment to his Māori friends. His tone is direct and demonstrates his anger at the injustice, as this extract shows. He writes, "When a flagrant act of injustice has been committed by the governor of a British colony in the name of Her Majesty the Queen, it is not easy to determine on what course to pursue. If indeed an Englishman were the sufferer, either the courts of law or the public press would afford a sufficient guarantee that the injustice would be remedied. But when an Aboriginal chief is affected by such an act of injustice, neither of these avail him. He may be 200 miles distant from any judge of the Supreme Court, and he fails to enlist the sympathy of the public press. Feeling deeply convinced that such an act of injustice has been committed by Colonel Brown, the governor of this colony, and his recent forcible expulsion of William King from land inherited by him from a long line of ancestors, I venture to address your grace as Her Majesty's Secretary of State for the colonies and to call your attention to the facts of the case." As well as demonstrating his anger at injustice, this extract also draws our attention to the ways which Hadfield views justice. Implicit in his writing is a belief that the British government is committed to justice, and that a disclosure of the facts of the case would be enough to reverse this unjust decision. However, his confidence might seem misplaced. Perhaps an Englishman with the kind of education and background as Hadfield might be able to expect justice, but it wouldn't take much searching to find a litany of people who had suffered injustice because of the British government within Britain itself. For example, the Highland clearances, with which many of you may be very familiar, were taking place during this time in Scotland, and land enclosure in England was taking land from common use to be put into private ownership. English writer and environmental campaigner Nick Hayes and Scottish Quaker and activist for land reform Alistair McIntosh's accounts of these events demonstrates that this is not a problem of distance from justice, but habitual practice of the British itself. It appears that for Hadfield, one of the key problems facing Kingi and the displaced Maori is their distance from the court and the difficulty they would have in enlisting public sympathy through the press. But this appeal to the British government can be framed in a less hopeful light by turning again to Jennings and his reflections on James's execution and Peter's imprisonment in the book of Acts, chapter 12. Jennings states, "The prison always announces worldly power and reveals those intoxicated with the lust for violence." He does not mean the violence of the inmate, but the violence of the system, of the state, and those in power. The prison is part of the tools of statecraft and empire, and the kind of justice offered by the prison is the justice of King Herod, not of Jesus. It's designed to silence opposition and to bring pleasure to the political and religious leaders. Jennings writes, "Christians, like no one else, should understand how easy it is to return to prison, not because of human failing, but because of failed systems that are calibrated against the powerless, the weak, and the poor, and work best against insurgent voices pressing for systemic change." Through Jennings' readings of Acts 12, Hadfield's hope for justice can be interpreted as misplaced because the state's priority is maintaining power, not justice. It draws attention to the fact that throughout the entire pamphlet, Hadfield does not seem to doubt that the route to justice is through the courts, and he does not appear to ask the question of what a biblical conception of justice might bring. As womanist scholar Audre Lorde has reminded us, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And here, the tools of British justice will not reverse the injustice of British Empire. Returning to Jennings and his reflections on prison, it's interesting to note that the Church's response in Acts 12 is not to seek justice from the state, but to turn to prayer, as did the 500 Maori chiefs in their petition to the Queen. We can see resonances with the confidence a white person would have on calling on the police, as compared, for example, with a person of colour. The Maori are much more aware of the structures of power and injustice, and while Kingi seeks to appeal monarch to monarch, they know that the justice they seek is not given by the courts of empire, but by God. Of course, there might be another way to read this. We are assuming that the pamphlet expresses Hadfield's feelings and understandings, but this may not be true. And community organising, for example, Saul Alinsky's fourth rule is make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. The have-nots make the haves live up to their own rules. Hadfield's is a public letter and therefore written with an audience in mind. A more generous reading of Hadfield would suggest he's trying to reveal the acts of the British Empire for what they are, not the noble generosity of a commonwealth, but the smash and grab of a criminal. It's one of a series of ways to shame one's opponents into acting justly, to show them the gulf between what they claim and how they act. His letter could then be read as an act of contextualisation and of public shaming. In some ways it's effective. The governor is removed, but the injustice at the heart of the problem, the illegal taking of the land, remains unremedied. Ultimately, justice was not done. The British Empire did not act justly. Not only that, as in many former places of empire, the acts of the unjust are celebrated and even remembered by having streets and memorials named after them, whereas those mistreated are forgotten. In many ways, Hadfield can be seen to be on the right side of history, but it's not clear whether these experiences around seeking justice and the lack of justice for Maori caused him to question underlying assumptions about British justice. Moving on now to theological anthropology. As we turn to reflect on Hadfield's theological anthropology, another extract from his pamphlet is helpful, which shows both his deep love and respect for the Maori, and at the same time an understanding of Indigenous peoples which is jarring when read in the 21st century. So he writes, "Nothing but the deepest conviction of the present critical state of this colony and Colonel Brown's utter incapacity to rescue it from disaster and ruin has induced me to address your grace. It is still possible that the presence of some superior man might restore the confidence that is lost. A little delay may occasion a war of races." No doubt Great Britain has men and money wherewith to carry on against the native race a war of extermination. But is this to be the issue of the endeavours to establish Christianity and civilization among one of the most intelligent and tractable of races? Are we, in the middle of the 19th century, to confess to the whole civilized world that our Christianity and our civilization have given us no advantage over these people, but that of a more scientific use of material force? Is the pride of Englishmen to exclude from the breasts all sympathy for a race but recently emerging from barbarism, because its qualities too nearly resembling their own, because it repudiates degradation and refuses to be submissively trampled underfoot? Is the sound of war once again to deafen their ears to the cry of justice? In this extract, it's difficult to unpick the seemingly paradoxical nature of Hadfield's theological anthropology. On the one hand, he values his relationships with the Māori and sees the way that diversity enriches the community. But in the next sentence, he seems able to name them as a formerly barbaric race. To do this, he seems to draw on a kind of British exceptionalism. He sees the British as a pinnacle of civilization to which the Māori should aspire. He appeals to this pride, naming it as a reputation to be maintained, not by descending into war, but to be civilized. English theologian John Hull explains how the use of the Christian faith as the ideology of the British Empire changed and distorted theology in the Christian faith. Studying the sermons of chaplains to the trading companies and the writings of other theologians in the 16th century as the British Empire began to expand across the world, he identifies this distortion. One particularly stark theme is the turn to the Old Testament, where he notes how the political classes were attracted more to the ideals of the Hebrew kingdom than to those of the suffering Messiah. The justification became, when a Christian nation conquers a non-Christian nation, it is really Christ who is the conqueror, and led to a sense of superiority of the faith of the English over other colonising nations. According to Hull, these developments and the expansion of the British Empire led to an emphatic contrast between Christianity and the dark savagery of the non-Christian world. As the stark contrast plays out in North America, Hull notes the argument is simple. God has given the earth to human beings, but the native peoples of North America are not human. They are mere beasts. Having dehumanized them, any objection to their colonization is void, and the way is cleared for Christian Britain to follow the example of Joshua. The requirements of power and possession shape biblical interpretation, Christian doctrine, and the practice of faith, rather than being challenged by them. So this tying together of civilizing the savage and the Christian faith is clearly visible in Hadfield's account. The underlying anthropology inherited from the requirements of empire shapes his worldview. In a sermon on Māori mission, he points to their degrading superstitions, their cannibalism, the maintenance of a particularly brutal form of slavery and infanticide, noticing human life was not valued very highly. He then tells stories of how violent Māori became peaceful, civilized Christians. This narrative maintains and reinforces the binary described by Hull, and it feels particularly striking from the 21st century that he could use brutal slavery as evidence of their barbaric state, with no reference to the equally horrific Atlantic slave trade exploited by the British not many years before he was writing. Interestingly, in an article about the chief Te Ruru Aprahama, he describes how no careful observer could fail to notice the courage, self-reliance, and independence of the Maori. He praises them for not being a revengeful people, and yet maintains the language of savages. So this close attention allows him to call into question some of the assumptions about Indigenous people in the particular setting of the Māori, but it does not cause him to question his own language and inherited assumptions about Indigenous peoples generally. He accounts for it within the logic of the anthropology he has inherited as one of the most intelligent and tractable of races, allowing him to place them on a continuum closer to the civilized end and an exception to the rule rather than a debunking of the whole theory. So what would happen if his deep friendship and appreciation of the Māori had not just caused him to look more positively on this particular Indigenous people, but also to begin to question the colonial logic of how he was encouraged to look at them in the first place? Would it have been possible for his friendship with many Māori to cause him to ask questions about the colonial logic under which his own missionary endeavour took place? All of the above shows how Hadfield continued to operate in a logic of empire. This was a logic of land ownership, of private property, of courts and judges. Significantly, it was a logic which tied Christian faith with British culture. This logic caused him to see aberrations rather than a broken system. And in the argument over land, he saw the problem as corrupt individuals rather than systemic. There's an implication that the Māori need to be fully incorporated into empire rather than empire itself being challenged. For example, in one of England's little wars, he briefly refers to the kingitanga, the Māori king movement, where a number of tribes came together to try and elect a king to oppose British rule. He praises Kingi's refusal to participate and to stand for the crown as one of the key reasons the uprising failed. He appeals to Kingi's loyalty to the British Empire as one of the reasons why this injustice should be righted. Having shown that in many ways Hadfield continued to operate according to a logic of empire rather than argue for a binary assessment, this more complex account can be a means to interrogate the logics of empire within contemporary mission. As we identified at the beginning, this paper is written within empire, and we must avoid the temptation to suggest that the answer is simply to step outside the logic of our own system. British theologian Luke Bretherton, in his careful study of capitalism, points out the naivety and the inherent anthropology in an assumption that some act of revolution or some alternative ideology will somehow restore order. He notes the need to resist rendering contingent social, political, or economic orders immutable and determinative of what it means to be human. He argues that capitalism needs to be unveiled as neither neutral or inevitable, but that the answer is not revolution. This assumption that it's possible to be outside the system and untainted by it fails to account for sin and domination, and it makes the same mistake of seeing a temporal program as able to bring really what only Jesus' return can. He suggests that what is required theologically is both sober and radical. A hope for change, which seeks to convert and reconfigure both from within and without. He writes, redirecting its discursive and structural apparatus to different God-given ends. This entails both recollection and rupture, being salt and light, conservative and radical, continuity and change, prophetic critique of what is and what was, as well as messianic hope for what will be, but is beyond human control or determination. Jennings says something similar in his reflections on the Book of Acts about being between empire and diaspora. He says faith is always caught between diaspora and empire. It's always caught between those on the one side focused on survival and fixated on securing a future for their people, and on the other side, those intoxicated with power and possibilities of empire and of building world ordered by its financial, social, and political logics that claim to be the best possible way to bring stability and lasting peace. What does it mean for Hadfield to be an advocate, friend, and participant, and to live in between empire and diaspora? Some would like to convince us that revolution can overthrow empire, as if some utopia exists this side of the eschaton. Some would like to convince us that we have to be a separate people, a city on the hill, separate from the machinations of empire. And yet Hadfield attempted a middle road. Hadfield knew the complications and complexities, and he did this within the logic of empire of which he was a part. We cannot draw a simple line between empire and revolution. Instead, there is a need to embrace the complexities. But even in saying all this, it's clear from our critique that while there is much to learn from how Hadfield got this right, there is also much to learn from how Hadfield got this wrong, his blind spots, assumptions, and unwillingness to question the logic within which he lived. So we began this paper with a question about whether Hadfield was a pioneering prophet or a complicit colonialist. Hopefully by now it's clear that such labelling is too simplistic and generally unhelpful. And yet so often the temptation is to do just that. To find a way of either justifying some as good or writing them off as bad. But in raising questions about Hadfield, our intention is not a simplistic judgment of history, but to allow the lens to be turned on us in the 21st century. As we have shown, Hadfield stood up to the British Empire in a number of ways. He engaged in good practices of cross-cultural mission. He developed deep friendships with Maori. And yet he also had blind spots to the ways in which empire shaped his practice and worldview. As a historian from this university, Tony Ballantyne, has so deftly explored in his book, Entanglements of Empire, Missionaries, Maori and the Question of the Body, relationship with empire and with Maori is complex, layered and rarely straightforward. We are embedded in empires, and we are not. The aim is not to discredit Hadfield, nor to hold him up as a model, but to see him as someone like us, who has a complex relationship with his political and social context. So how can we learn from Hadfield's strengths and his blind spots about our own entanglements with empire? So while we may not feel that we are part of blatant colonialist expansion, we are still entangled within the logic of our day. We've already highlighted capitalism and the complex relationship that Christians and churches have with its particular construction of what it means to be human. We could add to that list money, race, gender, sexuality, being differently abled, neurodiversity, and climate change. We have suggested that Hadfield's encounter with difference through his friendship with Maori raised awareness of injustice, but that there was much more to be opened up. Similarly, we have suggested that a closer reading of scripture alongside and with Maori might have caused Hadfield to question some of these underlying assumptions which came through his writing. So if revolution is not the answer, how might we open ourselves up to difference and to scripture in such a way to, in the words of North American theologian Walter Wink, unmask the powers? In what ways are we complicit with unjust systems which dehumanize others? Which dehumanize both us and others, in fact. What is the implicit anthropology in capitalism? And why is it that society seems unable to confront and deal with climate change? Similarly, we might question the patterns of investments by churches. We recently heard of Christian organisations being encouraged to sweat their assets, with little theological reflection on what exactly that might mean. But there's also a deeper critique to be made. Churches investing in the latest technology, multi-million-pound refurbishments, failing to pay a living wage to their cleaners, or importing the logic of capitalism around perpetual growth into their theology of the kingdom. We may feel like we are living faithfully, but there are plenty of voices encouraging us to listen more carefully and to reflect more deeply. UK minority ethnic Christians are telling us that our structures and patterns of ministry remain racist. We need to listen carefully. People living in areas which will be wiped out as sea levels rise due to climate change are telling us this is urgent. Differently abled friends tell us that they are tired of being marginalised and overlooked. In many parts of our world and in our own society, women still experience a glass ceiling and feel unsafe, not only on the streets, but in their own homes. We are just as entangled in the empires of today as Hadfield was. And if there's no option to step out of it, how can we be sober and radical and be part of realigning it from the inside and out? Perhaps it starts by listening, and listening well. It may require painful exchange as we slowly learn how we continue to emulate empire. It may require learning other languages, both actually and metaphorically, and having friends, as Hadfield did, in these varied and diverse communities. We cannot step out of empire, but we can be exposed to its brutal reality, learn to live differently within it, and seek its conversion from both the inside and out. Thank you for listening.